Okay. Well, new research from the University of Michigan. I can practice. Well, new research from the University of Michigan says think again. In fact, they found from vegetable to vegetable, an urban farm creates 6 times the amount of greenhouse gas emissions as a conventional farm. Why? Reporter Dominic Halton.
Hey.
Hi, Dean, newscaster.
Hell yeah. All right. Hope they know I'm yellow. Columbia Radio News. Oh, we're live in 1 minute.
I know. Oh, they can hear us. They can hear us.
Good thing I said heck.
Oh, I can close it. How are we doing? Fahima?
Now I'm putting my phone away.
Smiles? Let's go.
I'm putting my phone away now. I'm putting on airplane mode.
Oh yeah, that's a good thing because my WhatsApp is still on. Welcome to Uptown Radio. Thank you for joining us for the last show of the season. It's Thursday, May 9th. I'm your host, Clara Bouders.
And I'm Fahima Degia. Urban farming can be relaxing and good for mental health, but it may not be as environmentally friendly as you think.
You know, therapists are expensive, and putting your hand in soil, it's more affordable. Pretty much.
Opioids in the U.S. are killing more than 70,000 people each year, and experts say pharmacies and national chains are accomplices.
One guy who was like, I'm going to be right back. I'm going to go do coke while he was like waiting for the pharmacist to fill his oxy prescription.
There is another epidemic that is especially affecting young adults and the elderly: loneliness. There is no vaccine available, but there's a class that might help.
Our mind tells us that we are going to die. Oh my God, I'm going to be refused. What people is going to think about me?
All that and more after the news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Lakshmi Singh. The White House is standing by its threat to withhold more weapons if Israel launches a full-scale invasion of Rafah, a southern Gaza city where more than 1 million Palestinians displaced by the Israel-Hamas war are taking refuge. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby defended President Biden's position today.
An enduring defeat on Hamas certainly remains the Israeli goal, and we share that goal with them. Smashing into Rafah, in his view, will not advance that objective, will not get to that sustainable, enduring defeat of Hamas.
On the eve of Israel's Independence Day, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said in a video message that his country is strong enough to fight alone if it has to. Stormy Daniels has finished testifying in New York. Prosecutors say former President Donald Trump greenlighted hush money payment to the adult film actress during the 2016 campaign to keep silent about their alleged sexual encounter years earlier. NPR's Andrea Bernstein reports the defense repeatedly confronted Daniels with inconsistencies in her story over the years.
On Tuesday, Daniels had described feeling a power imbalance when she saw Trump in his underwear in his hotel room. Defense attorney Susan Necklace lit into Daniels, asking her why she hadn't talked about that in a 2011 interview interview with In Touch magazine, never published. But Daniels held her ground, saying it was an abbreviated interview. At the end of the cross-examination, Nicholas asked, "Isn't the reason your story keeps changing because you never had an affair with President Trump and realized you could make money from selling your story?" "No," Daniels said. Prosecutors then came back with their own line of questioning, emphasizing consistencies in Daniels' story. On balance, has your publicly telling the truth been a net positive or a net negative in your life? The prosecutor asked. Negative, Daniels said. Andrea Bernstein, NPR News, New York.
In Haiti, the country's newly minted transitional council's walking back some decisions. It says it'll re-elect a transitional prime minister and it may consider a rotational presidency. NPR's Ada Peralta reports the capital is experiencing relative calm.
The streets of Port-au-Prince are remarkably normal. There's traffic and sellers on the streets. Kids head to school, adults to work. But on our ride across the city, we spot 2 dead bodies on the side of the road. The local morgue has been burnt by gangs, so sometimes bodies just stay there. At a park near the National Palace, the talk is all about the international peacekeeping force expected to deploy in the coming weeks. Some say it'll cause more problems, nor do they want foreign troops here. But Jean Adejan shouts that he is sick of the violence. Send us heavily armed men, he says. He was forced out of his home by warring gangs. All he wants, he says, is peace, no matter how it comes. Ada Peralta, NPR News, Port-au-Prince.
This is NPR.
For Columbia Radio News in New York, I'm Dean Condoleo. 3 Columbia students are suing the university for access to their dorm rooms. The 3 students, who were involved in the occupation of Hamilton Hall, were suspended by the school. They're asking Housing Court to grant permission to gain access to their dorms and remove their belongings. The lawsuit claims that Columbia unlawfully evicted the students by changing their dorm locks and kicking them out with less than a day's notice. The Intercept has calculated the cost of NYPD's clearing of Columbia's campus last week at $200,000. They're basing it off estimates of the size of the police force and cost per officer. The NYPD announced the total cost for all the overtime to manage protests in the city has reached $53 million since October. It looks like Harvey Weinstein will be staying in New York for now. He appeared at the Queens Supreme Court today. A court will decide in August whether he should stay in the city awaiting retrial or be sent to California to serve his 16-year sentence there. This comes after the New York Court of Appeals threw out his 2020 rape conviction, ruling that he did not receive a fair trial. A male couple filed a first-of-its-kind lawsuit against New York City. They argued that the city's health insurance plan is discriminatory. It does not cover in vitro fertilization, or IVF, for male couples. Briskin and Maja Pinto are prepared to use a surrogate to deliver the baby. Out-of-pocket costs for everything could be upwards of $250,000. They say the city covers IVF for straight and lesbian couples and single women, but not for male couples. A 15-year-old is in police custody. She's accused of having stabbed to death one of her schoolmates. 17-year-old Sarah Rivera was found near Queens Boulevard and 46th Street subway station in Sunnyside. Sports. Madison Square Garden has become the capital of the NBA and NHL playoffs. The Rangers face the Hurricanes tonight in Raleigh. They're up 2-0 against Carolina. Puck drop at 7 o'clock. The Knicks took Game 2 against the Pacers last night. They head out to Indiana for Game 3 tomorrow night. The Yankees take on the Astros tonight. First pitch in about an hour at 5:05. For Columbia Radio News, I'm Dean Condoleo.
When the COVID-19 pandemic started, the rates of violence against Asian New Yorkers rose. According to the New York City Commission on Human Rights, there was a 7-fold increase in reports of anti-Asian harassment, discrimination, and violence between 2020 and now. Jennifer Wu is a lawyer who's represented many victims of anti-Asian hate crimes in the city. She told Uptown Radio reporter Zoe Yee that discrimination and even violence against Asian people existed before the pandemic, but the fact that the virus originated in China and high-profile politicians, including former President Trump, blamed China for the pandemic, that all led to the increase of hate crimes here.
It is very common for the majority to blame or people who they don't see as belonging to America. And so when there was sort of a trigger, which is the pandemic created a lot of stress, it's very common in that kind of, sort of cauldron when it boils over for people to blame people who are foreigners and say, get out of my country. And that's effectively what you were seeing with anti-Asian hate, is that people started targeting Asians as, one, a scapegoat for the pandemic, But secondly, as somebody who didn't belong to America, and therefore when times are tough, you blame other people, and it's easier to blame people that you don't think are your family or not the same as you. When it comes to Asians and American, we are as American as anyone else. Everyone in America is an immigrant. We are also immigrants, but yet we are considered perpetual foreigners.
During the pandemic, what are some behaviors of Asian hate?
Yeah, and I don't want to say Americans hate Asians. That's a very problematic term for me because I'm American and I don't hate Asians. So I don't think it's true that Americans in general hate Asians, but people died because of anti-Asian hate. There's a grandmother who was sweeping, who was assaulted with a rock. She died. There was a woman who was living in Chinatown who was stalked up 5 flights of stairs and she was killed. There was a woman who was in Yonkers who went into her home and she was beaten 125 times by a neighbor while yelling anti-Asian epithets. There was a delivery person in Queens who was shot on his scooter with a gun and he died, leaving a widow and 3 children. There was a man named Yao Pei Ma who was in Harlem collecting cans on the street and he was beaten viciously. He died. The perpetrator later pled guilty to a hate crime.
And what about now? Is anti-Asian hate a little bit better or is it even worse compared to 2 years ago?
That's impossible to know because people don't report anti-Asian hate crimes. The majority of Asians don't say anything unless you've died or there's serious injury. So the reality is that it hasn't tapered off, but it doesn't get as much news attention. And it's a very simplistic question just to say it's getting better because why does it matter if it's getting better or not if it's just going to come back later?
Why do you think the majority of Asians don't say anything?
For the same reasons that Asians are the model minority. They don't like to report, but fundamentally it goes back to being a foreigner. There's fundamental distrust in the institutions in America that are supposed to protect us because in the same way that others don't perceive us as American, we don't feel American enough to go to the police, to understand the justice system, to trust the hospitals will take care of us. Particularly if the victims of anti-Asian hate are undocumented. It can be very frightening to report something to the police because you're worried that you've done something wrong. And even if you are documented, you may not want to go to the police because your experiences with the police were not good ones.
So what do you think we can do to make ourselves and our neighbors feel safe?
So I think that each individual can make a big difference here simply by reaching out to people who are not like you. We tend to cluster within ourselves. If all our friends are all Korean or all Chinese or all Vietnamese, and we only hang out with people who are from the same general background as our parents or we are isolating ourselves in a community and we're not creating allies. My biggest supporters during the pandemic were Jewish people and the Black people. Their communities had experienced hate for much longer than our communities, and they were able to give me advice on that.
I think it's a little bit of paradox to me here because when someone is feeling unsafe, he or she is probably less likely to reach out to other people.
Correct. That's why I'm telling people to do that.
All right. Thank you.
For weeks, the gates of Columbia Morningside's campus have been closed. As of today, there are just 2 entrances open. Last week, 44 protesters affiliated with the Hamilton Hall occupation of Columbia University were arrested.
Fearing additional disruption, Columbia President Manoj Shafiq closed the gates of Columbia to the public and to many students, and canceled the university-wide commencement. It's raising issues for a lot of people. Irina Humaniuk reports.
Tuesday, April 30th, is a historic evening for Columbia University. The sun has set. A group of students wrapped in black and white keffiyehs are chanting outside of Hamilton Hall. We will not stop, we will not rest this close! On the other side of Hamilton Hall, the wrought iron gates at 116th and Broadway and the gates at 116 in Amsterdam are locked. Right after 9 that evening, hundreds of members of the New York City Police Department entered through a south gate and arrested more than 100 pro-Palestinian protesters. But Columbia didn't always have gates to control traffic in and out of its urban campus. Historian Robert McCoffey has written a lot about Columbia's connection to New York. He says there was a time when College Walk was a public road that was permanently open.
When Columbia settled on Morningside Heights, it went from 116th through 120th, the way Barnard does now. And then it acquired what we call a South Campus, which is south of 116th Street. But 116th Street was a public thoroughfare.
In 1903, Columbia acquired Southfield. McCoffey told me that Columbia's relationship in the Upper West Side was largely peaceful until the 1950s, when Columbia decided that it wanted to expand.
It started with Columbia really feeling some spatial constrictions. It had very little room to grow, and needed to grow, or at least it thought it did, if it was going to keep up with the competition.
McCoffey says in the 1960s, New York City was a comparatively much more dangerous place.
There were lots of streets you didn't walk on at night. There were concerns. There were muggings.
In the early 1960s, Columbia received a gift of nearly $90,000 from the Delacourt family. They wanted to build the decorative iron gates at either end of College Walk. In the letter from Columbia thanking George Delacourt for the donation, it said, "These improvements of the gates will have aesthetic improvements on the lives of students, wherever they may go." The university started building the gates in 1967. When protests erupted in the spring of 1968, the gates were locked to the public.
But students did chant, IDA must go, and Columbia's campus had a revolt.
Bob Feldman was a student protester at Columbia in the 1968 demonstrations. As Feldman remembers it, Columbia was supposed to keep the gates open. But in the weeks following the arrests in the spring of 1968, Columbia closed the gates. Kind of like it's done now.
And it was actually challenged by some community residents and plus some students and a few faculty members on the basis that this violated the agreement to keep those gates open.
Seas low, stop expansion, ban ROTC.
The iconic gates at the 116th and Broadway entrance are nearly always open. They're closed each year for commencement and during big citywide emergencies, like 9/11. And then there's the events that are considered campus emergencies, like the recent encampment. Soban is a security guard at Columbia. Earlier this week, he says he saw a group of protesters picketing in front of the president's office. The gates were the only thing protecting the protesters and the president's office from each other.
I feel like it's like 50-50. It's like it could protect them in a good way, but at the same time, it's like not really. So it's like, I don't know, 50-50.
Sugan is a data science student at Columbia. He doesn't want to give his full name for fear of retribution. He feels that he's paying too much tuition at Columbia to not be able to access its facilities.
So I feel like if we're paying students, we should have the right, especially during finals week, to have access to gyms, libraries, the sauna. I would be in school more than my own house, so it kind of like was a piece like taken away from me. So
Zain, who also did not want to give his last name, is a graduate student from Pakistan. Because one of his graduation ceremonies has been canceled and the other moved off campus, he says his parents aren't coming to New York to see him anymore.
So they were pretty disappointed about that, and they decided that it's not worth it anymore for them to come because, New York is expensive.
Kai, also no last name, is a graduate student at Columbia. He says that the encampment was one of the most beautiful communities he has ever seen.
Those camps really symbolized something super important right now. And it was just really, really heartbreaking to wake up the next day after the arrests and everything happened and just see the photo of those camps being completely dismantled and the gates being shut off.
It's enough to make him want to boycott commencement, even if it hadn't been canceled.
I just can't care about a commencement when this university has been so poor in acknowledging the wider tragedy that's taking place right now.
Next week, rather than looking up at Low Library from its steps, parents and students might only be looking at Columbia through the bars of its gates. It's unclear what commencement day will bring. Irina Humeniu, Columbia Radio News.
Every year, hundreds of fans gather on Fifth Avenue to catch a glimpse of their favorite celebrities walking the carpet at the Met Gala. But while many know it as the Oscars of fashion, it's also an annual charity event centered around an exhibit honoring fashion's history. It's curated by the Met's Costume Institute. Ahead of the public's access to it tomorrow, Uptown Radio's Christina Makaya takes us into the Met for a sneak peek.
You're hearing the sounds of the hundreds of fans that gathered around the Met this Monday. They came to catch a glimpse of their favorite celebrities celebrating fashion's biggest night of the year, the Met Gala. This year's theme was Sleeping Beauties, reawakening fashion, and attendees did not disappoint.
Look at her. Zendaya was just one of the many stars in full bloom.
That's TV personality Gayle King. She attended the event on Monday and says it's not just about the celebrities and screaming fans. It's also an important event for the Met's Costume Institute.
It's always fun, the lights, camera, action, see who's coming with who and
people
what
forget
everybody's wearing.
in the glitz and
You're
the
right, but everybody forgets the main purpose is to raise money for a very important institution for the work that they do.
The cause she's talking about? Preserving a history of clothing. The Met's Costume Institute has been running the gala for nearly 80 years. They're the only self-funded department at the museum, and all proceeds help fund their annual exhibition displaying precious clothing. This year, the gala charged a whopping $75,000 for individual tickets and $350,000 for a table of 10. But the high prices seem to have paid off. The 2024 Met Gala raised a record of more than $26 million. That's 4 more than last year.
But it sure is fun, and the exhibition was amazing.
Now, what was it like inside?
Yes.
We want to know.
This morning, we found out. At the entrance of the exhibition, far from the Met's crowded galleries and loud, echoey halls, a wall reads, "Sleeping Beauties, Reawakening Fashion," in bold letters. On display are dozens of delicate gowns that look right out of a fairy tale. And a lot of them have never been seen by the public before. They were just too fragile to exhibit. Until now. The most delicate pieces are displayed lying flat. Those are called Sleeping Beauties. But while exhibition goers will not be able to touch the garments, different smells and sounds in the space help them touch the clothing with their eyes, ears, and noses. From flower dresses made of metal to coats with embroidered flowers and birds. The exhibition is bringing fashion to life, reawakening it through the senses.
Just smile when you see it. It's a happy feeling.
Still, many fans of the gala don't know about the exhibition it honors.
Are you going to stop by?
Where is it?
At the Met.
The Costume Institute's new show opens to the public tomorrow, May 10th. Tickets are included with museum admission. Christina Makaya, Uptown Radio News.
Red Hook, Brooklyn is going through a bit of its own field of dreams. Build it and he will come moment. A group of community members has started a Sunday morning baseball clinic in hopes of getting neighborhood kids to come out and play ball on their own fields.
With the help of some sponsors, the Red Hook Baseball Champions hosted their inaugural training sessions for local youth this past Sunday. And as Desiree Nick-Fartram reports, it's going to continue.
What hand do you throw with?
The Sunday morning quiet is about to be disrupted.
Bats and baseballs.
On the northeast corner of the newly refurbished fields, a group of kids, ages 3 to 8, are picking out baseball gloves.
Yours is coming. We got to find the one that fits on your right hand.
For most of them, this is their first time trying on a glove. Jonathan Landreth is their coach, and once they get sorted, he gets them out on the field to warm up.
All right, come on out. Let's go. James, come with me. Come with me.
Landreth lives nearby in Windsor Terrace.
My league frequently comes to play on these fields. And we noticed that there were no kids from the neighborhood playing on these fields.
Landreth looked for someone who might know the score, and he found Imra Kovac, a neighborhood booster. Kovac is in his 80s and has lived in Red Hook for 16 years. He's also noticed that local kids weren't using the fields, and he'd seen how a Little League team in his nephew's town in New Jersey brought the community together.
In looking at the stands in Little League games, okay, you see what it does to the people from the town. They go nuts. I said, this place needs to go nuts.
Landreth and Kovac teamed up and recruited a Park Slope Youth League, 78 Youth Sports, which donated bats and baseballs.
Some kids said, I like football better. Some kids have never watched baseball. Some kids love baseball and clearly have a talent for baseball. Everyone here is welcome.
But before the kids start playing, they need to warm up.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10. Other arm, left arm.
Red Hook has the largest public housing development in Brooklyn, and it's far from any subway. The area around the fields is pretty industrial, with an IKEA and an Amazon warehouse right around the corner.
You know, I mean, Amazon comes and goes, you know, there's stuff that happens here. This is sort of a dead-end spot for the city.
Most of the kids are shy at first, usually looking over to their parents on the sideline for reassurance from time to time. Vijay Iyer lives in Red Hook. He's watching his 5-year-old son.
There he goes, look at that. He has good hand-eye coordination.
Yeah. His son is tossing a ball back and forth.
I'm just interested in having him do sports generally, and he's been interested in doing baseball, so this is nice.
Iyer says he's happy the kids are getting a chance to use their own fields.
It's also great to invest in the Red Hook neighborhood. I think that's something that, you know, they closed the library because they're renovating it, and we don't have that here, and then it's just harder to get investment in this neighborhood.
And if the kids end up liking it, maybe they'll continue.
Nice job. One more time. Okay. Remember, we don't move the glove. We let the ball come to the glove, right?
Around 11 a.m., older kids start to take the field. The young ones get together for a photo. One of the adults is handing out flyers for summer camp. Iyer's son Ram is eager to get one. It has a QR code on it.
It's a Minecraft maze.
It's a Minecraft.
But before letting the little ones go, Landreth, the coach, gives the rookiest rookies a helpful tip to break in their gloves.
At night, when you go home, you take this glove, and you take this ball, and you put the glove in the ball. And then you put it underneath your mattress, and you sleep on it. Okay?
Do you think you'll sleep on the glove?
I could just put it underneath my cover.
Or maybe you just get a really big book.
I do have a really big book.
Well, that might work.
Little
It's unclear how many will make it to the majors, but for the next few Sundays, they may learn to love the game.
Say, baseball!
Desiree Nikfarajam, Columbia Radio News.
And now for another one of our personal perspective series, how do we become our own person when we follow in our parents' footsteps for most of our lives?
Cecilia was a very serious dancer, but she now describes her relationship to ballet as a situationship, a relationship with messy boundaries, especially as she works to make peace with her past.
Ballet, following in the footsteps, quite literally, of our mum. She grew up in a small town in northern Italy, the kind of place where wanting to become a professional dancer was frowned upon. People would ask, how are you going to make money? What will you do when you can no longer perform? Still, she kept at it. Without a local performing arts school or opportunities to study abroad, she had to fit her training around her college classes. Her routine was like clockwork. Classes in the morning, and then at 2 p.m., she rushed to the studio and spent the rest of the day dancing. In some ways, that was my life for 15 years. I was in preschool when my mum signed me up to my first ballet class, and even now, my childhood memories take place backstage in a London theatre. Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker and the intoxicating but comforting smell of hairspray. My seriousness paid off. I liked being good at something so difficult, but around the age of 15, all the joy I felt when dancing disappeared. A lot of it had to do with my teachers. I had a sudden 8-inch growth spurt and they freaked out. You see, in ballet, your physique is everything. I often overheard my teachers talking about who was going to become a star, a goal that seemed as much about looks as talent. Dancers who developed larger breasts never made it past a certain point. In my case, I was plagued by my skinny ankles that would always get injured. I was starting to see all the things I wouldn't be. Yet I was determined to continue. I didn't want to disappoint my mom. The breaking point eventually came. It was during training, and I had a really heavy period. My teachers insisted I wear my white leotard with no underwear and no pad, so as not to ruin the aesthetic of the class. I spent the whole time worrying instead of enjoying the dance. I realized this had been my mentality for some time, and it just didn't feel worth it anymore. So I quit. Telling my mum was hard. We were in a shopping mall after class when I told her. She understood, but even today it makes her sad.
I'm sad of the reason why you stopped, not because you stopped, because for me, a good teacher knows how to find the joy out of each single child. So that makes me really upset because the way they treated you and other students.
I've thought about those teachers who managed to crush my passion, and that in some ways, I let them. It made me resent ballet for years. But now, when I think about all those years of hard work, I focus on the positives, the discipline and the creativity it taught me, skills I use now as a journalist. I try to never miss a deadline. I don't want to let my teachers win forever. I'm pretty sure someday I'll dance again, and maybe I'll enjoy it.
You might catch Cecilia at the Lincoln Center when her mom is in town for graduation. In the audience for now.
And now for our Sounds of the City series, Uptown Radio Zoe Yee takes us inside the world of a student writer with a passion for Legos.
Olivia Williams, student writer in the Bronx.
I like writing. I think it's always just been a part of who I am as a person. One of the things I'm doing now is I'm incorporating a typewriter because typewriters make you give up perfection. I'm a very crafty person, so if I'm not writing, I'm probably like crafting something. Like I like building Legos. That's a really good pastime for me. It's very sentimental, something I used to do with my grandmother. I think crafting is about the process, which I think is right. That's writing. Writing is about the process, how you get to an end result. And so I'm spending these past 2 years writing something only to have like 180 pages at the end of it. But I enjoyed the journey there.
You're listening to Uptown Radio, Thursdays at 4.
And we're back. The time is 4:30. You're listening to Uptown Radio. I'm Clara Bouders.
And I'm Fahima Degia. Coming up, fewer men are becoming OBGYNs. We look at why and how male OBGYNs are working differently.
Also on the healthcare beat, hospitals are supposed to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. But how can they do that while keeping their services safe?
Later in our show, I'm going to talk about how I kind of became the family disappointment and eventually the golden child. All that and more coming up. But first, the news.
In New York, I'm Pascal Hogue. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is responding to President Biden's decision to withhold some weapon shipments to Israel. Netanyahu said in a statement that Israel will fight with its fingernails if necessary, but that, quote, it has much more than fingernails. President Biden announced yesterday that the U.S. had paused the shipment of heavy bombs to Israel over concerns that they could be used against civilians in Rafah.
I've made it clear they're not going to get our support if, in fact, they go in these population centers. We're not walking away from Israel's security. We're walking away from Israel's ability to wage war in those areas.
The U.S. president has voiced growing concerns over Israel's plan to wage an assault on Rafah, the last major stronghold of Hamas in Gaza. It is estimated that more than 1 million civilians are sheltering in the city. Biden clarified that the pause would not affect the U.S.'s shipment of rocket interceptors and other defensive weapons for Israel's Iron Dome. This morning, a shipment of humanitarian aid set sail from Cyprus for the new U.S.-built pier off of Gaza. This is the first shipment of aid to be sent to the pier, whose construction was announced by President Biden 2 months ago. The pier is intended to create a new point of access for humanitarian aid into Gaza. Earlier this week, Israel's military seized Gaza's Rafah crossing with Egypt, shutting down a crucial entry point for humanitarian assistance in the war-torn region. Stormy Daniels finished her testimony in the Trump hush money trial today. Daniels faced sharp questions by Trump's lawyers over her credibility as a witness and of her assertion of a one-night sexual encounter with Trump in 2006. Her testimony is central to the $130,000 hush money payment she received ahead of the 2016 election. Trump is charged with 34 felony counts of falsifying business documents over that payment. A federal jury in Manhattan convicted financial executive Bruce Gerlich over an insider trading scheme that involved Donald Trump's social media company Truth Social. Federal prosecutors had charged Gerlich with leaking confidential information in 2021 to two people about the imminent merger of Truth Social with a publicly traded shell company. This netted the pair almost $23 million in trading profits when the merger was announced later that year. Gerlich could be faced with at least 25 years in prison. Tesla has been accused by a U.S. labor agency of discouraging workers at an assembly plant in Buffalo from union organizing. The National Labor Relations Board issued a complaint last night claiming that Tesla's workplace rules barring the use of cell phones and other personal devices violate U.S. labor law. Heavy storms struck the southeastern U.S. this morning, leading to flooding in several cities and causing delays at airports in Atlanta and Charlotte. It has been a week of severe weather for southern states. Yesterday, tornadoes left 3 people dead in Tennessee and North Carolina. Stocks were up today. The Dow rose 331 points to close at 39,388. For Columbia Radio News, I'm Pascal Hogue.
Trump's hush money trial continued today, with the porn star Stormy Daniels once again taking the stand. Gregory Germain is a law professor at Syracuse University. He says while Daniels and Trump's alleged one-night stand back in 2006 has been at the heart of the testimony this week, it may undermine legal maneuvers in the courtroom. I spoke with him to get the latest on the case.
It was definitely hush money. What we mean by hush money is paying someone money to enter into a non-disclosure agreement. We call those NDAs in the law, under which they agree not to disclose the nature of their relationship.
Would you say that that's illegal?
Well, I think that's the only way that they could frame it. So if Trump had directly written the check to Stormy Daniels, there's no way that would constitute a criminal act. And there's an argument that the payment to Stormy Daniels was a campaign contribution. So maybe it was a campaign contribution, but the amount wouldn't have been illegal because there are no limits on how much Trump can spend of his own money on a political campaign. But whether it's a political contribution is kind of doubtful.
Why do you think that the court is allowing such explicit testimonies from Stormy Daniels that aren't even relevant to this case? Like, is there a tactic behind that or a strategy behind that?
Well, I think the judge was very uncomfortable that it went so far because it sounded like a sexual harassment case or something. It didn't sound like a documents case. And the judge said, I wish the defense had raised more objections. Well, the defense objected to her being a witness at all. I think the judge lost control of his courtroom a little bit in allowing the detail of testimony that Stormy Daniels gave about their relationship. But I think it made it look to the jury like she was telling the truth because she had very detailed information about their relationship. And so all of this testimony probably helps the prosecution by making it look like Trump's lying about not having had a relationship. So I think it probably helps the case, but in a way that is really prejudicial to the defense.
My main question that I had is what is the main strategy that the defense is using and the prosecution?
Most criminal attorneys will tell you that they don't want to put a criminal defendant on the stand. And that's kind of the conventional wisdom. And I've never been a believer in the conventional wisdom. But we're talking about Donald Trump here. And Donald Trump is absolutely uncontrollable. Every time he has taken a stand in a New York case, he has gotten killed by the jury or the judge. And he does not come across truthful. He's very insistent and belligerent. And so if I was the lawyer, I would do everything I could do to keep Trump off the stand. I think the prosecution is not being very clear about exactly how they meet the elements of the crime they have alleged. And so kind of as a technical legal matter, it's a very difficult case to understand how they have a crime here. On the other hand, they've got a lot of kind of salacious details and embarrassing information that they are putting before the jury that has virtually nothing to do with the criminal claims.
And then do you think a mistrial is going to happen because of all these like unnecessary details, like you said, that are coming out in the case that aren't even about legality?
So one possibility is they don't get unanimity by the jurors and there's a mistrial. And I think if that's the case, they won't bring the case again. If they can convince all the jurors, maybe because the judge simplifies the case by not clearly stating all of the elements that need to be proven, and they are able to obtain a conviction, the big question is, what's the penalty? And this is a Class E felony. This is the lowest felony under New York law. And it is kind of unheard of to sentence a first-time offender of a Class E felony to jail unless there's violence. So I don't think the judge is going to sentence him to jail. And if they don't sentence him to jail, what does he get? Well, he'll get a year or two of probation or something like that. And he's back on the campaign trail, you know? I mean, it really won't have done much that is relevant to the election, which is really what I think the people bringing this case were hoping for, is to kind of knock him out of the election somehow.
Thank you so much, Gregory Germain, law professor at Syracuse University.
Well, it was fun. Thank you so much.
From politics to science, small urban farms and community gardens are common across New York City. Part of their appeal is that many of them claim to offer a healthier, more environmentally friendly alternative to buying fruits or vegetables from supermarkets. So, Fahima, urban farms, a green alternative, right?
Well, new research from the University of Michigan says, think again. In fact, they found from vegetable to vegetable, an urban farm creates 6 times the amount of greenhouse gas emissions as a conventional farm. Why? Reporter Dominic Hall Thomas headed to some of the city's urban farms to dig into the numbers.
Matthew Walker is the kind of guy who likes his vegetables fresh, like straight from the plant fresh.
So here we had some kohlrabi, and these flowers are all edible as well, if you'd like to try one.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so he's picking one off the plant itself.
Yeah. Has a bit of a broccoli flavor to it.
It does have a bit of a broccoli flavor to it.
Walker is the head of Battery Park Urban Farm, and like many of the 1,000 farms in the city, it's a pretty small plot. It's dwarfed on one side by the skyscrapers of Lower Manhattan and hemmed in on the other by the East River. Rows of vegetable beds run in strips down its length, some neatly planted with a cacophony of bright green spring stems, others still a muddy mound.
The ones that we haven't shaped yet look like Toblerone to me, that we're going to sort of smooth out a bit before we start planting them.
The farm's goal is to help grow sustainable and fresh produce, but also to educate school children and gardening enthusiasts. And they do this in a number of ways. Kids and volunteers can help out at the farm, learning how to compost, choose plants that will benefit local wildlife, and of course, run a farm without environmentally damaging chemicals.
We manage everything entirely organically, meaning that we don't add any chemical fertilizers or pesticides or herbicides to the farm.
But despite the farm's best efforts, new research from Michigan University suggests that a head of broccoli grown on an urban farm might have a carbon footprint that is much larger than a head of broccoli grown on a conventional farm, meaning an industrial scale farm that might sell their food to a large supermarket or restaurant chain. When I asked Walker for his reaction to the study's findings, he said, He's a farmer, not a scientist, so he accepts the results. But he was keen to point out that the environmental impact of conventional agriculture compared to urban farming is complicated.
There's so many variables at play in terms of if a big farm is using a tractor and all of the fossil fuels that go into the use of that tractor or go into the production of that tractor versus smaller farms that might be doing everything by hand.
But some in the farming community weren't so forgiving. The study faced backlash from experts who said too few urban farms were studied, and those in the urban farming community were quick to point out that the study underestimates just how damaging conventional agriculture can be. Depending on who you ask, Jake Hawes, the author of the study, is either the hero or the villain of urban farming. His study was supposed to teach urban farmers how to be more environmentally friendly rather than to criticize them. Instead, he's found himself at the center of some conspiracy theories for his work.
Some of the more interesting conspiracy theories we've heard, let me just say we were not associated with the World Economic Forum. We're not working for Monsanto.
You see, what Hawes' study found was that despite urban farmers' best efforts to use fewer chemicals or compost to their heart's content, they're often wasteful in comparison to the streamlined business of commercial agriculture. A small urban farm might get themselves going by buying wood for raised beds, a few plastic water butts, and fertilizer for a few seasons, and then, within a few years, have to close. And when they close, most of that equipment that created a lot of greenhouse gases when they were being produced isn't used to its full potential. The average urban farm in New York City lasts just under 8 years before closing, according to Hunter College's Food Policy Center. And they close for all kinds of reasons, but mainly costs. New York is an expensive city. Paying for equipment, water, and fertilizers means simply balancing the books is a big challenge. And so many farms rely on volunteers to operate. All the way back uptown in Harlem, Judy Desiree from St. Nicholas Miracle Garden knows how tricky it is to find volunteers to keep an urban garden open. Desiree works full-time and then on the weekends works with her volunteer team to keep the garden running. She takes care of it, and in some ways, it takes care of her.
You know, therapists are expensive, and putting your hand in soil, it's more affordable. Pretty much.
And even though she hadn't heard of Hawes' research, she did think that it didn't reflect what she had seen in her time gardening in the city.
Were you surprised to hear that?
Yes, because from at least many of the garden spaces I know, they don't use chemicals. Most of the garden spaces came from a time where the city had kind of a lot of asbestos and lead in the soil, and so you have a lot of gardens that's trying to remedy and reduce chemicals in the soil.
But in many cases, these plots aren't the gardener's own land. Like a lot of New Yorkers, many farmers are renters. And Jake Hawes, the study's author, says some landowners would rather use the land for something more profitable, like a parking lot.
So basically, they build up this garden, including the infrastructure, and then some developer buys the lot. There goes the garden.
A small community garden might only be there for 5 years, maybe a decade, but a giant conventional farm might be there for 6 generations.
Yeah. So what I've been trying to make clear is we are absolutely not advocating for tearing out all the gardens, because, in fact, our results would indicate that if we tear out all the gardens, we are hurting the carbon footprint of what urban food is getting produced.
Back at Battery Park Urban Farm, Matthew Walker, the head program director, and his team will be celebrating the farm's 14th birthday this year, far longer than the average farm lasts in this city. And they're looking forward to a new season of fruit and vegetables, including some favorites they've grown in the past.
We tried out some small mini watermelons, and those have worked well enough for us if we can get them before the squirrels do.
They've already figured out how to stick around. So hopefully, figuring out the squirrels will be light work. Dominic Hall-Thomas, Columbia Radio News.
Okay, Fahima, let's talk about loneliness. The Surgeon General has defined loneliness a public health issue. Other officials have called it an epidemic or a crisis. And a new study points to how young adults and elderly people more often experience loneliness.
As Claire Davenport reports, an unconventional class is now trying to get New Yorkers more comfy while talking to strangers. Here she is now.
Nolita is hopping. It's a gorgeous Saturday, and the streets are packed. Unshyness class instructor, Marcel, is urging new student Pratik to stick around.
Okay, let's another 10 minutes, okay?
10 minutes?
Yeah.
I might do this exercise and then I'll go. Is that okay?
I will simplify it, okay?
Okay.
Don't be scared.
It's Pratik's first Unshyness class. It's 30 minutes in, and while he says he has to go meet a friend, Pratik seems kind of done.
How are you feeling?
Good. But I think this one is not for me. It's too much for day one. I'll do it next time.
But Marcel ultimately convinces Pratik to stay just a little bit longer. At last, Pratik and his classmate Brendan do the assignment. They stand on either corner of Spring and Mulberry and roar like lions.
We are lions!
If this sounds slightly uncomfortable, that's because it's supposed to be. Unshyness is a class that pushes people out of their comfort zone.
Yes, we are overcoming our fears, but it's not about struggling. We are having fun firstly, okay?
That's Marcel Schwed, the founder of Unshyness. He's not a therapist, but he knows what it's like to feel terror when meeting someone new.
Our mind tells us that we are going to die. Oh my God! I'm gonna be refused. What people is going to think about me? We logically can understand that people don't care, but your body, your mind tells you no. You are going to die.
Unshyness is a translation of a Russian word, Marcel's native language. It means to engage with someone.
And what we are doing here, we are training our minds. It's like a mental training that you're not going to die. You are okay.
Lindsay Johnson is a professional counselor who agrees.
I love that. What we know about anxiety is the best thing is that exposure. And that's throwing yourself into something that you wouldn't without doing too much planning ahead of time. Just doing it.
She also appreciates Marcel's focus on body language. She works with a lot of young adults and tells them something as simple as smiling or wiggling your eyebrows can tell your brain, hey, it's time to go talk to people.
And we can make gestures, again, to communicate to others openness and friendliness. It makes us actually have the urge to socialize, which is super interesting.
Brendan is the other student in Unshyness today.
Communication, understanding how the communication is received by the other person, making connections beyond the surface level.
That deeper connection is something Brendan says he'll need to make his new bakery successful. This is a job for him, so he came in a suit.
There's some that involve doing interactions with people that, you can't really control the response, and so you're practicing that.
Marcel originally started Unshyness in Russia in 2016. He decided to start the group for an age-old reason.
I was scared to talk to people. I was scared to talk to girls that I want to talk.
Then he started teaching these joyful, silly exercises, and more people started coming. Women and couples joined. It seemed like he had keyed into a larger need.
The most amazing thing when people tells me that it changed their lives and it really works, oh my God, I feel like it's like a purpose.
Marcel had to leave Russia because of his involvement in protest movements against the Russian government.
It was the 6 months before the war started, but the situation in Russia had already been bad. Alexei Navalny was already imprisoned.
I think it's so interesting that you were someone who had struggled before with talking to a girl, because political protest, that's scary.
I don't know, maybe it's different things for me because it's like a personal, I don't know even how to compare this.
Marcel realized New Yorkers could use his help as well.
I love this project and it's like an art for me. When you live this way, it's interesting way of living. You feel alive.
I spoke with NYU sociologist Eric Kleinenberg. He researches people having space to make connections and has written a number of books focused on loneliness.
The reality is that in the modern world, a lot of people don't feel like they always have the connections that they need, but they also have a lot of capacity to go out and build them.
He is not persuaded that there's an epidemic of loneliness. He actually thinks loneliness can be the kick in the butt people need to get out there sometimes.
So some amount of loneliness, we think, is probably a healthy response to conditions that aren't ideal.
But putting yourself out there can be scary. Brendan told me why he thinks social interactions make people so nervous.
My guess would be the unpredictability of the response. I think it's like probably, you want to be wanted, you want people to love you. If you get refused, then, you might think, oh, this person doesn't love me, or is that, am I not enough?
But despite New York's reputation for being cold, it seems people in the city are looking to connect.
Do people tend to respond more positively than you would expect?
My first class, yeah, that was a big epiphany, I would say, was the responses were overwhelmingly more positive and more warm than I was expecting. But there's more of everything in New York, so there's a lot of closed off people, but there's a lot of open people as well.
So this weekend, why not get out there and start a conversation? It's good practice. Claire Davenport, Columbia Radio News.
You can find Claire somewhere in Olida, roaring like a lion as she celebrates graduating journalism school this weekend.
Honestly, I can see her do that.
No, for real. But back to healthcare. Governor Hochul has released a plan to make New York hospitals greener. The governor's climate action plan aims for hospitals to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. But there's a balance between the push for more eco-friendly hospital practices and a question about reducing patient care. Alex Heil teaches sustainable management at Columbia and NYU. He's been following the governor's proposal closely. He told me there are some concrete things hospitals can do to get started.
I applaud the governor's interest in certainly starting this decarbonization process. We all need to think about how to not disrupt critical services that hospitals provide.
What would be the first aspect that hospitals change to become more environmentally friendly?
Healthcare in the US overall is 8.5% of greenhouse gas emissions. About a third of that is in hospitals by themselves. You need to think about how to source the electricity and the energy that you're using for hospitals, meaning is it green, is it coming from renewable sources, but also what are the efficiencies and what can actually be achieved by reducing usage, because if you reduce usage, you become more efficient. There's just less electricity you need to buy in the first place. So it's both looking at the usage itself as well as the source of where the electricity is coming from.
So you would say that the main aspect or the most damaging thing in hospitals is electricity?
I think it's, if you look at its operations, procurement, transportation, waste management, but the low-hanging fruit initially is certainly on operations. On the operation side there's a lot of energy demand that comes from just providing patient care, surgeries, procedures, treatments, anything along those lines.
How do you regulate hospitals? Is it one specific entity who regulate policies in hospitals, like public schools, or how does it work?
Certain things are probably broadly regulated and others are much more specifically up to the discretion of local hospitals or hospital groups. So I think that there are certainly sufficient areas in hospital operations, procurement and waste management that are at the discretion of hospital management. And I think they can be looked at and addressed. And I think in a sense, that's what the governor is trying to achieve with her initiative.
Right. So it's not that a government official can step in to implement a certain policy.
I don't know the ins and outs of the healthcare industry that well to really say speak to the regulatory component. I think that's a fair question in terms of where the incentives lie. And I think the incentives are usually balanced between hospitals. They operate like a business in many cases, and they function by focusing on a bottom line in addition to providing, quality of care to patients. It's usually an industry that is subject to inefficiencies because of this complex net between the provider of care, the insurer, and the patient. And you take this sort of triangle of interrelationships there, and that's going to make things much more complicated. And then you layer on top of that any kind of government overseeing regulator, and it gets even more complicated than that. And I think one needs to look at what is the best lever to pull. But the plan that the governor sort of advanced here with her proposal is certainly one that would suggest hospitals to develop climate action plans similar to what the state has done.
These action plans, do you think that they will cost a lot of money to become more environmentally friendly?
We're looking at the impact from climate change and certainly what rising temperatures mean for impact on workers. I think there's a real argument to be made here that hospitals play a role in mitigating some of these costs by planning for a future in which climate impacts are more severe.
Even if hospitals start right now in trying to become more green, do you think it's realistic for them to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050?
It's going to be hard to say that the sector is going to be fully decarbonized by 2050. Healthcare is by its very nature an energy intensive industry. I mean, we can all imagine, the average operating room with a host of electric devices and equipment. All are, some of them are life sustaining, others are just critical for providing other care. And if you look at emissions in the US, they have fallen since the mid 2000s, largely because there's been some more efficient use of energy sources. There's also been efficiency when it comes to devices, but it's a long way from there to net zero by 2050.
Thank you so much, Professor Alexander Heil in Sustainable Management.
Thank you, Clara, for having me.
A heads up to our listeners. The next story deals with the sensitive issue of sexual assault. The U.S. is experiencing a growing OBGYN shortage. Physicians are getting older, and new restrictive abortion laws can make it harder for some OBGYNs to do their jobs, discouraging new doctors from picking that specialty. At the same time, the number of men entering the field is decreasing. My co-host, Clara Boulders, tells us why and how male OBGYNs are working differently.
On a Tuesday morning in Greenpoint, Sarah steps in her studio apartment with floral patterns everywhere. On her bed, on the table, and she's even wearing a chocolate brown sundress with small flowers on it.
I'm from California, and I definitely take my colorful coastal aesthetic with me.
Sarah is one of many patients who prefers a female OBGYN. I'm not using her full name because Sarah was sexually assaulted, and she's not comfortable sharing the details publicly. The recent exposure of Dr. Robert Haddon, a former gynecologist who was convicted of sexual assault, has only made her feel worse. He was found guilty of assaulting hundreds of women for decades at Columbia University Hospital. Lawyers put ads in the subway to notify potential victims about the case. For Sarah, the news made her feel sick. It brought her right back to 2015, when she was sexually assaulted by her own male OBGYN.
I felt like I had a burning sensation in my down there area, so I assumed that I'd had a urinary tract infection or a UTI because I'd had UTIs in the past. And normally, I'd go to the doctor, give a urine sample, and then they'd give me antibiotics. I remember I went to the USC Engelman Health Center. According to my foggy memory, and also according to documents from the situation, was that the doctor instead examined me.
Most of the time, when a doctor does an exam, it's normal or necessary. But Sarah knew something was wrong because in the past, when she had a UTI, she never got an exam. So she told her roommate something was wrong.
I remember my roommate saying, oh yeah, she heard too that he was creepy. I didn't realize that creepy could actually be, doing something illegal.
She only realized years later, when the LA Times published an investigation on her OBGYN, what had really happened. Her doctor had assaulted potentially thousands of women.
For years, I kind of realized, again, after the fact, I would wear certain clothes to hide my body because I really just wanted to avoid having men look at me, if possible.
Including male doctors, especially OBGYNs. While reporting the story, I heard from over 80 people. Most of them identified as female. Some said they don't care who their OBGYN is. as long as their insurance covers them. Others have been very happy with their male OBGYN. Very few mentioned the recent cases of sexual assault, but the majority of the people I heard from were resolute. When it comes to OBGYNs, gender does matter. Dr. Lee is a male OBGYN. That preference is all too familiar to him.
It happens at a minimum, maybe once per week, every other week, and then sometimes even more frequently so. The most frequent example is as simple as me seeing a patient in clinic and them explicitly stating I'd prefer a female provider. And that can sometimes be just for the exam portion or for the visit as a whole.
Lee says he became an OBGYN because of his firm belief that healthy communities are built on healthy women. He recognizes that some of his patients may have experienced injustice or assault, and that means he's happy to work harder for them.
And you cannot ignore that and just be blind to it. And I think it's incredibly appropriate impact that it does have. I think as a male OBGYN, you have to be cognizant of that fact and work even harder to overcome. Maybe you're starting from one step back in terms of building trust with your patient.
According to the American Association of Medical Colleges, when it comes to gender, OBGYN is the most lopsided medical specialty. 85% of current OBGYN residents are women, and that percentage is steadily increasing. For New Yorker Catherine Maller, the trust she had in her male OBGYN disappeared the moment she gained weight.
I graduated, I started a job, and as happens when you start a desk job, I gained a little weight. I think I gained like 5 or 10 pounds.
Maller was only 20, and it was only the second time she'd been to an OBGYN. She wasn't sure what to expect, and she felt vulnerable.
He was just like conducting his exam, and then he's in between my legs. I'm naked from the waist down, and he's just asking me like, oh, well, what are you doing for exercise? Like, what are you doing to keep fit?
These questions might not make everyone feel bad, but as a 20-year-old young woman and a much older male doctor looking at her thighs, Maller felt fat-shamed.
I was speechless, and I was ready to have the appointment be over and get out of there as fast as possible. I never went back to him because I felt so uncomfortable.
Dr. Wen researches gender bias in the medical field. He's also a male OBGYN at USC, and he has some tips for his male colleagues, especially those who teach.
I think it's really important for medical professors to emphasize that our number one job in teaching the next generation of physicians is radical empathy.
He says radical empathy means being willing to understand where a patient is coming from, and to put that above all else you're thinking or feeling.
And to prioritize that over what we may be feeling. We may be prioritizing our own education or our own ego.
Sarah, the Greenpoint resident who was sexually assaulted by her doctor, her own traumatic experiences kick in every now and then. She even gets nervous when she has to go to an eye doctor. The fact that he is a man and a doctor is enough. Preparing doctors for patients like Sarah is why Dr. Wen says another critical strategy is making sure medical schools teach trauma-informed care.
The best practice that we can do as providers of sensitive services is to, make the baseline assumption that this patient is a sensitive patient who may have been through some kind of trauma, and therefore that should inform the way that we should practice.
Sarah's traumatic experience didn't make her hate men. She has many men in her life she loves, like her boyfriend. But for now, she's sticking with women OBGYNs. Clara Bowders, Columbia Radio News. The U.S. is dealing with an opioid epidemic that's killing more than 70,000 people each year. And in an effort to diminish overdose deaths, the government has placed heavy restrictions on the prescription of controlled substances. But public health experts say pharmacies and national chains in particular have also contributed to the epidemic. As Julia Lay reports, critics say that while prescribing a controlled substance gets harder and harder, the process of purchasing it is still not properly regulated.
On December 18, 2009, April Romero got a call that would forever change her life. It was about her youngest son, Joey.
We got a call from his girlfriend letting us know that he had been found in his off-campus apartment, unresponsive. Downstream from that, we learned that he had passed away in his bedroom there. And that the cause of death was actually multiple substances in a system that included prescription drugs he had been prescribed by a doctor just 9 days before.
Rovero shows me a slideshow. Joey as a baby in red and blue overalls. Joey in his football uniform. Joey posing for a school picture.
He was a great person, a great young person that had all the potential in the world, and unfortunately, it will never be realized.
Joey was just 21 when he died. After his death, Rovero founded the National Coalition Against Prescription Drug Abuse. His mom blames Joey's death on the doctor who she says prescribed him a dangerously high-dosage cocktail of Soma, Xanax, and oxycodone, which are all controlled substances, drugs whose circulation is restricted by the government because they can cause addiction. The doctor was later convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to prison for the overdose death of 3 of her patients, including Joey. But Rovero says the blame is not just on the doctor.
The entire supply chain was really complicit in the end, and it was all about money for all of these different entities.
And Rovero says the pharmacy didn't run proper checks.
The pharmacy consistently filled her prescriptions with no questions asked.
The number of people dying from prescription drug overdoses has grown 6-fold over the past 2 decades. Since 2017, the U.S. has implemented laws to limit the inappropriate prescription of controlled substances, and opioids in particular. But while prescribers are being required to take all sorts of precautions, pharmacies are not as tightly regulated. Until April of this year, Marty Roger worked at a CVS here in New York City. He was a technician, not a pharmacist, but still one of those gatekeepers, the people on the other side of the counter physically handing out drugs to clients. He told me about instances when he handed out controlled substances without asking any questions.
We would get a few people late at night throughout the time who were like pretty clearly high, and like one guy who was like, I'm going to be right back, I'm going to go do coke, while he was like waiting for the pharmacist to fill his oxy prescription. But in that situation, it's like, yeah, it's New York and we're living on Columbus Circle and it's 11 p.m. If I tell the pharmacist, he's just going to be confused as to why I'm telling him, like everybody knows. So you just put it through.
Critics say it is moments like this that can lead to the death of people like Joey Rovero. And Rogers says he was troubled by what he experienced on the job. It's why he agreed to use his name in this radio story. A CVS spokesperson said via email that employees can report workplace concerns anonymously if they're worried about retaliation. But Rogers says he didn't feel confident about that promise.
But I like kind of kept my mouth shut because I was brand new, and like I was like, okay, well, I've got to like learn what the culture is here. And then I realized that the culture there is that there is no proper way to do things. It's just get everything out of your face as fast as possible.
Over the past decade, thousands of lawsuits have been filed against CVS and other big pharmacy chains for allegedly mishandling opioids. Last year, the country's 3 largest pharmacies agreed to a big national settlement.
CVS and Walgreens paying out $10 billion to settle lawsuits over the opioid
Walgreens
crisis.
and Walmart have tentatively agreed to pay at least $12 billion.
The lawsuits accuse the chains of filling opioid prescriptions that should have been flagged as inappropriate.
According to legal documents from the case, the pharmacies agreed to a list of reforms intended to improve safety and better monitor suspicious orders. The changes were also designed to help pharmacists make more attentive judgments. But some experts say there are still big problems in New York. To understand why, we have to go way back before the settlement. 2013, that's when New York introduced an electronic database where pharmacists and doctors could track controlled substance prescriptions. It's called the Prescription Monitoring Program, or PNP, and it's still in place today. Louis Nelson acted as a consultant for the PNP in the program's early days. He's a physician.
Let's pretend like you were prescribing me a substance, for example. And what would the process be of checking out the Prescription Monitoring Program today?
you are supposed to go in to the prescription monitoring program and see your patient's recent and remote prescribing history.
In other words, it's another way for doctors to make sure patients aren't involved in suspicious activities.
And you are supposed to make a decision based on that, whether or not they are being overprescribed, whether or not there's some aberrant use potential, so that you won't then prescribe more opioid or any controlled substance for that matter for that patient.
By law, prescribers in New York State, meaning doctors, have to check the PNP before writing a prescription for a controlled substance. But Nelson says they don't always. Why?
So it's a lot of work. I mean, it does take, I don't know, a minute or two, but it's a minute or two that just adds up over time. It's interruptive of flow.
But unlike physicians, pharmacists are not required to check the PNP. They're only invited to, which means that in many cases they don't. That's according to Nathaniel Rickles.
Unfortunately, that takes time.
Rickles teaches pharmacy practice at the University of Connecticut and worked as a pharmacist for almost 3 decades, including a few years in New York State.
And if you're in a busy pharmacy where you're trying to make some profit, that you don't always have the time.
Rickles says that if a pharmacist suspects someone picking up a substance might be misusing it, then they should check in with the prescriber. But once again, time is a big problem, especially if you work in an understaffed, big pharmacy chain. And even when there is time to check in with the doctor, a pharmacist is likely to receive an answer along the lines of,
"Hey, why are you bothering me?"
This is the beginning of a problematic chain. A doctor files a prescription for a controlled substance, but might not check the database. Next, the prescription goes to the pharmacist, who also might not check the database because the law does not require them to. Sure, they could call the physician, but maybe they're short on time, so they may fill the prescription anyway. Finally, it's pharmacy techs like Marty Roger who become the last link of the chain before the medication reaches a client. Roger says he noticed another problem. A CVS policy requires an ID for everyone picking up a controlled substance. But he says it's very easy to override the system, which makes the practice useless.
I asked, what is the procedure here? Several times, and eventually just kind of figuring out, okay, it doesn't matter what I do. Nobody cares, nobody wants to tell me what to do, so I'll stop asking.
CVS says the policies in place at their pharmacies are comprehensive. Their pharmacy teams are trained in the appropriate and lawful dispensing of prescribed controlled substances, and that the company supports the fight against opioid misuse. Joy Rivera's mom, April, says that fight needs to include tighter restrictions so that kids like her son have a better chance of avoiding overdose. Julia Leo, Columbia Radio News.
The past few days, synagogues and Jewish places of community have experienced an uptick of security threats. Columbia University was home to about 1,500 Jewish students in 2023, according to a Hillel International survey. Given the high population on the campus and recent tensions around Israel, Irina Humaniuk asked if the increased threats to safety change how the community uses the Craft Center for Student Life.
It's a Wednesday evening in Morningside Heights, and the sun has just set over the Craft Center for Jewish Student Life. Asher Strill is lounging on the 3rd floor of the community center. During his time at Columbia, he's never seen more security stationed outside.
Hillel has shut down twice, and the Jewish Theological Seminary has had a much higher increased presence of police outside, and we've received, I believe, at least one threat this year, and I've never seen it at this frequency.
But Strill is relatively unfazed with the increased anti-Semitism that has resulted from the attacks in Israel on October 7th. He's still going to come to the Craft Center, also known as Hillel. There's only one thing that would give him cause for concern.
If there's a credible threat that's been given from the FBI or Homeland Security about the Jewish base, then that's when you start taking it much more seriously.
But this hasn't happened yet in the Columbia community. Students like David Lederer, have been coming to the Craft Center even more frequently since the October 7th attacks.
This has become a safe haven for many Jewish students on campus.
And for some, like Adina, no last name, an architecture student at Barnard, she says her relationship to craft hasn't changed in the last year, even with the increase of threats. Like Letterer, this is a place where she feels in community.
I don't feel like I have to watch what I'm saying or watch what I'm wearing or what identity markers I have on me.
While many people's perception of security at the Craft Center hasn't changed, other locations near campus, like the dean's residence, have been on high alert.
The dean of Columbia, we used to have security from 4 to 12. That's it. Now we have 24-hour security.
William has worked on Columbia's operation and facilities team for 18 years. He says that Columbia has a robust security team. He hasn't heard of any serious threats made on Jewish spaces at the university. One thing is certain, even with the threat of violence, the Jewish community of Morningside Heights will continue to come to the Craft Center to study with friends, to pray, to be with community. Irina Humeniu, Columbia Radio.
For most of her life, Uptown Radio's Fahima Degia and my lovely co-host was the perfect Indian Muslim daughter. A hijabi with a 4.0 GPA, did not talk to boys, nodded her head often, and did all the housework because who would want to marry her if she did not? But that hasn't always been the case. Next, for our Personal Perspective series, she explains how she became the family disappointment, and then the golden child.
It started the day I walked into the student center in high school. I heard the claps. I was 15 years old, wearing a gray cardigan, a white button-down shirt, a mini skirt, leggings, and all black boots. The school uniform. The only thing missing from my outfit that day was my black and blue hijab. When I heard the claps from the other kids, I was in shock. Because I'd never felt so visible before. I had always been the quiet kid. The good kid. This moment was a big deal for me because I grew up in a very strict traditional Indian Muslim household. Before this, I always wore a hijab. In my religious family, it was expected of me. It wasn't forced on me. I am not bashing the hijab. I am a proud Muslim woman. The hijab was just something I wanted to find for myself. And this was my first time without it. It felt weird and I felt guilty. There's a joke in my community that the aunties love to gossip. And I was so worried that someone from my neighborhood would see me and tell my mom. In my family, the women are very modest and conservative. Taking off my hijab in public was like coming out. Despite my guilt, I continued to rebel in little ways. I would secretly put on makeup in the morning and take it off on the BX10 bus before I came home, to prevent my abba, or dad, from finding out. I put on unblended blue eyeshadow and super white foundation and red lipstick. This was before beauty influencer videos. I thought I looked so good. I was living a double life. I took my senior pictures with the hijab on and quoted Mindy Kaling in my yearbook, but I took off the hijab after pictures. I had a guy best friend who I would hide from my mom, and we would indulge in the depths of romance novels in the hopes that I would find my knight in shining armor to save me. I even tweeted at my favorite authors. I would have you know Sarah Dessen, who wrote The Truth About Forever and Dreamland, plans on having chocolate cake with me in Seattle. I had my first crush on a boy named Louis, a popular bad boy. He skipped school all the time. I even decided I wanted to go to college. That's something that my parents at the time didn't approve of. They'd brought their kids to the West, but they wanted to hold on to tradition. They wanted me to prioritize looking for a husband. I wanted to go to school. I decided I'd become a disappointment to the values that my family had instilled in me. I would pray to God to help me. I felt so bad. I lived a double life for 5 years. It took me until my sophomore year of college to unofficially show my parents I was no longer wearing the hijab. It started by slowly wearing only a scarf around my neck, not wearing it to do errands in my neighborhood, rocking a bun, wearing it only at family events, and slowly but surely, they came around. Looking back, I think they always knew, for real. But my mom was waiting for me to come to her. I slowly started talking to her about religion, Indian culture, and my life goals. I got more busy, and I grew up. I realized it was okay to be me and make choices for myself. I'd been worried my parents would disown me or send me back to India to get married, but my mom told me she did not judge me, as long as I remained Muslim and a good person. 5 more years have passed. I still worry about the aunties in the neighborhood seeing me breaking rules, or my parents yelling at me for wearing a crop top, so I always carry a sweater with me so I can throw it on if I need to. My parents still talk to me about getting married. They even try to play matchmaker and bring me marriage proposals, but they're proud of me now. No, I don't have a husband. Instead, I went to college, and I'm about to get a graduate degree. I realized my parents are human, not just parents. I became more understanding of them, and they became more understanding of me, but I hope they never listen to this piece.
Oh, Fahima, after hearing that, I really need to give you her girly.
Oh, she's really doing this. Oh, there's the hug.
Okay, emotional moment is over. Let's roll the credits.
That's it for our last edition of this season of Uptown Radio. We hope you enjoyed the show.
Our executive producer today was Samuel Eli Shepard. Leading our staff of reporters was senior producer Claire Davenport. And shaping up the edition was senior editor Tommaso Baronio with the help of assistant editor Julia Leo.
Director Maureen Saint coordinated our studio production team. In charge of webcasting and socials was Zoe Yee. Working the board was Desiree Nick Farjum. And on Soundbite was Dominic Hall Thomas.
Delivering our newscast were Dean Canaleo and Pascal Hogue. And day reporters Christina Makaya and Irina Humaniuk brought you the latest on the ground in New York. Our personal perspectives were brought to you by Cecilia Blotto and Fahima Degia.
Our instructors, Sally Herships, Carrie Donahue, and Priscilla Alabi, advised our staff this entire semester. Sally, Carrie, Priscilla, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you for bringing this show to life with us. We will always remember to slug correctly, stick to deadlines, and write a host intro. And speaking of hosts, I'm Fahima Degia.
And I'm Clara Bouders. If you missed Uptown Radio, you can always find us at uptownradio.org. Until next year, thanks for listening.